So let me tell you a little bit about Jillian. Jillian Cantor has a BA in English from Penn State University and an MFA from the University of Arizona. She is the author of award-winning and best-selling novels for teens and adults, including The Hours, Count, Margot, The Lost Letter, In Another Time, and Half-Life. Born and raised in a suburb of Philadelphia, Cantor currently lives in Arizona with her husband and 2 sons. So let's welcome her and let's get on with the show. I'm going to move my cursors around here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah, let me just sorry, everybody, I've got to move things around a little bit. Okay, so let's start off. Jillian, for those of our guests who have not had a chance to read the book, could you give them a brief description?
Yeah, sure. So this is my latest novel, Beautiful Little Fools. And it's a reimagining of the world of the Great Gatsby from the women's points of view. And it takes place before, during, and after the original novel. But it's sort of part reimagining, part historical novel about women's lives at the time, and then also part murder mystery. I have a detective who's investigating Jay Gatsby's death, and he finds a diamond hairpin in the bushes behind Jay Gatsby's pool when he's shot, and he suspects one of 3 women, Daisy Buchanan, Jordan Baker, and then Catherine, who is Myrtle Wilson's sister. And so you get to see their stories unfold in the years leading up to, during, the time of the Great Gatsby, and then also after.
So great, so great. Well, someone asked me earlier today, where did you get where did your idea come from?
Yeah, I've always loved The Great Gatsby. I read it the first time in high school, and I think it was the first book I was assigned to read, like first classic book I was assigned to read that I just truly loved. And then I read it again in college. I actually kept my college copy. It's still on my desk. And I would just kind of come back and reread it every year or two. And I don't reread a lot of books typically, but The Great Gatsby was one that I just would always come back to because I loved it, both as a reader and a writer. And I always thought about the women every time I read it. I always wondered about them. They're such a big part of the plot. The whole plot of The Great Gatsby revolves around the women. There's affairs and parties and glamour and recklessness and murder. And it's all about the women, but the women barely speak in the original novel. We definitely don't know what they're thinking or feeling. And so, I kind of always had it in the back of my head that I would love to know more about the women. And I think finally I wrote the book myself because I wanted to read it.
Could you speak a little bit about your choice of the title?
Yeah, so Beautiful Little Fools comes from a quote in the original novel, The Great Gatsby, and Daisy's talking to her cousin Nick, and she's telling him about when she gave birth to her daughter, and she says that she wishes that the baby would be a boy. And then when they tell her it's a girl, she says that she said, well, I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. And that's always been one of my favorite lines in The Great Gatsby. Nick takes it at face value, but I always thought there was more to Daisy beneath the surface and that she was not a fool. And so I actually had the title first, which is very rare for me. Usually I'm struggling with the title. I'll have a whole draft and I won't even have a title. Someone else, my agent, will have to think of it or something. But this book started with the title, and I knew it was going to be from the female point of view, and I knew it was going to be called Beautiful Little Fools right away.
It's a great title. How long did you have to percolate this idea? Did it take years or months?
I mean, I think it probably had been percolating for years because I had come back to, Gatsby again and again and read it. And I would always kind of think a little bit about the women. But from the time I actually decided to do it until the time I started writing was like a week. I mean, once I decided to do it, it happened pretty quickly. But I do think it's just because I had thought about it so much. And it kind of started in December of 2019, and I have a good friend who lives nearby, and in pre-pandemic times we used to go to lunch once a month and just talk about book ideas. And so I just mentioned to her once when we were at lunch that I would love to write Daisy Buchanan's story, and she would not let me leave the lunch. She made me promise that I would write that book. And then it was just like the next day I saw that there was an article, I think it was in USA Today, and it was talking about the fact that the copyright on the original Great Gatsby was expiring. So it actually came into the public domain last January 2021. So it kind of hit me like, maybe this is the perfect time to write this book right now. Yeah. And then I think I actually started writing it a few days after that.
So you wrote mostly through the pandemic.
I did. Yeah. I wrote 50 pages in an outline and I sold it to my editor just on that much in February of 2020. And I think I then had a deadline to turn the book in July 1st, 2020. But I wrote from page 50 to the end of the book from like March, April, June of 2020.
So the pandemic's probably a good thing for you.
Well, I mean, can we really say that? It was strange. At first, I took 2 weeks off because my kids were home from school. And, we all thought it was only going to be 2 weeks, that everything was, 2 weeks to flatten the curve and life would go back to normal. And then after 2 weeks, I realized that wasn't true. But I have this real schedule that I've always stuck by, where I would take my kids to school and then I would write when they were at school and then I would stop when they came home, and I didn't have any schedule. So it took me a little bit of time to sort of figure out my footing writing in that world. But then I actually found it was kind of freeing. I had nowhere to go and nothing else to do. I didn't have to drive anyone anywhere, and I didn't have to stop at 3 o'clock when school was over. And I found myself actually writing a lot between the hours of 3 and 7, which in normal times, I'm always busy driving someone or, going somewhere. And so it was just a much different process, I think, than normal.
I agree. Here we go. Who is your favorite character and who was the most fun to write?
I loved them all, I have to say. And I had so much fun writing this book. It was the most fun I've ever had writing a book. This is my 11th novel, but this was definitely the most fun to write. But I think Jordan really stands out for me. Yeah. She's so tough and so strong, but she has this real vulnerability beneath the surface. And she was just, whenever I got to a Jordan chapter, I was extra excited.
Would you like to do a little reading for us to share some of the text with the audience?
Sure. I'm going to just keep it pretty short since we're on Zoom, but I'm going to just read the very beginning of Daisy's first chapter, just so you can kind of get a sense of her, and then the very beginning of Jordan's first chapter, so you can get a little sense of her.
Perfect.
And the book there's a prologue, but I'm not going to read that. So you have to get the book if you want to read the prologue. But this is actually the first chapter after the prologue, and it's Daisy in 1917, and she's in Louisville, Kentucky. Sometimes I think if I'd met Jay Gatsby later, say after Daddy and Rose's accident, I wouldn't have even noticed him at all. I think how the whole entire course of my life and his might have turned out differently. Jay came into my life at a moment when I still believed that anything was possible. The war and death were somewhere so far away out of my reach that they might as well have not existed at all. I had everything, and it never occurred to me that I could lose it all just like that. It sounds silly to say it now, to remember how I was, to remember that careless, carefree girl. It sounds silly to say that Jay and I lived and died by chance, haphazard timing, that our paths crossed at the right time in the right place. Or maybe it was the wrong time and the wrong place. And then you get to see Daisy meet Jay Gatsby for the first time. Okay, so then Jordan's first chapter, which is actually the following chapter after this one. This is also 1917 in Louisville. It was a bona fide fact that Daisy Fay had the shiniest hair on this side of the Ohio River. I asked her once how she managed it, how even on the hottest day of summer, her acorn hair shone so bright, I swear to God, it shimmered like starlight. Oh, Geordie, she'd laughed and waved me away with a faux modest flick of her wrist. Then she leaned in conspiratorially and whispered, egg yolks. Egg yolks? Once a week, she'd whispered, I soak my hair in 6 egg yolks for a full hour. And that was why at the tender age of 13, I'd snuck into Mr. Barnaby's chicken coop next door one morning when Daddy was in court. I was in desperate want of extra egg yolks to make my hair as shiny as Daisy's, and I knew Daddy, who couldn't stand to waste food, would never approve. But Mr. Barnaby was blind as a bat and dumber than a wild turkey, and mistakenly thought I was an intruder. He shot first and figured out it was me later. He killed 6 of his chickens, but luckily I was unscathed. That is, until Daddy found out. Once he got the whole story out of me about why I wanted eggs in the first place, he cut my hair off with a pair of pruning shears. Vanity is for the weak, Jordan, he told me. I lay in my bed and cried for my hair that whole night. Not only would it never be shiny, but now it would be ugly too. I would be ugly. But then the next morning, I got up and I saw my reflection for the first time. I ran my fingers through the short streaks of chestnut hair around my ears. I was a different Jordan with short hair, a better Jordan, a tougher Jordan, and maybe tough was pretty. Daddy's punishment wasn't really a punishment at all, I decided, but a blessing. I'd worn my hair short ever since.
I love that. You've done such a good job with creating those characters.
Thank you.
Now that we just spoke about those two, how about talking about sister relationships and how friendship plays a role in this novel?
Yeah, so I mean, there are several sister relationships. Catherine is my third main character, who I didn't read from her. She's a little bit of a smaller character than Daisy and Jordan, but she still has a bunch of point of view chapters. And she's Myrtle's younger sister, and she's in the original Great Gatsby twice. So she has a very, very small role in the original Great Gatsby. We barely know anything about her, except that she has a red bob. She's Myrtle's younger sister. We see her when Myrtle has an party at her apartment with Tom, and Tom punches her in the nose when he gets mad at her and breaks her nose. Catherine's kind of there to help her. And then we see her at the end of the Great Gatsby. She's identifying Myrtle's body and she lies to the detectives. So that was all we knew about Catherine. But she's one of the main characters, like I said, and she's Myrtle's sister. And then Daisy in my novel also has a sister. In the original, we don't know if she has a sister or not. So her sister Rose is my invention. But I felt that Daisy needed something to sort of make her a little more sympathetic and give me a window of understanding into her. So I gave Daisy Rose. So Rose is definitely an influential part of Daisy's life. And what eventually happens to Rose is an influential part of Daisy's life. No spoilers. But I think I really wanted to sort of have that contrast between Daisy and Rose and Myrtle and Catherine, and just sort of the threads of, like, you know, what the sisters will do for each other and how they save each other. Jordan doesn't have a sister, but she's Daisy's closest friend, and so kind of like her sister. So there definitely are a lot of themes of like friendship and sisterhood running through the book. Yeah.
What made you choose Myrtle's sister to give her such a strong role in this tale? You know,
I mean, one, she was in the original novel, but she was so minor in the original novel that I felt I had a lot of leeway to make her who I wanted her to be. And my Catherine is a suffragette, who, you know, a very kind of forward feminist of the time. She arrives in New York in her first chapter, and she says she likes New York because she could be someone in New York. She didn't have to be someone's wife. She could be someone. And that is Catherine in a nutshell. She wants to be someone as a woman, not as a wife. And so I like the idea that I had some room to play around with her, but she still existed in the original. And also I wanted to get Myrtle's story in because I feel like Myrtle was one of the important women from the original, you know, whose side we never know. But as we all know from the original, Myrtle is murdered. And I felt like her story could only go so far. You know, Catherine's extends beyond the summer of the Great Gatsby. So I decided to sort of tell that part of the story from Catherine's point of view. And Myrtle, I think, has 2 chapters. So we get a little bit from Myrtle too.
Yeah. Let's see. We have your other theme is home. And would you talk about that a little bit and how you explore that in your plot?
Yeah. You know, Daisy and Tom are moving around a lot. Daisy marries Tom Buchanan, which we know from the original. He's extremely wealthy, comes from family money. As Nick tells us in the original, they moved wherever people had money and played polo. And Tom, you know, takes his polo ponies with him everywhere. He has like whole fleet of polo ponies. And so when I kind of like mapped out where they moved in the original, they moved a lot in the first 2 or 3 years of their marriage. They were in France, and then they were in Chicago, and then they were in East Egg. And when they get to East Egg, Daisy says, this is going to be my permanent home. But of course, by the end of The Great Gatsby, it's not their permanent home because Tom has messed up again. And they left Chicago because he had a little spree, which is never fully explained in The Great Gatsby, but there's an explanation for what happened in my book. So I felt like Daisy was always kind of unmoored. You know, she wanted a place to raise her daughter. She wanted a place to settle. And as soon as she would find this place, Tom would ruin it for her because, you know, he would have some scandal with a woman. So I got that from the original, but I also felt it a little more strongly in mine. And I have to say, as I was writing the first draft, not only was it the pandemic, which it was, but also I live sort of in the foothills of mountains in Tucson, and there was this huge fire in the mountains, and we had to pack up everything. We were like in the first evacuation zone. And so we thought for like 2 weeks we were going to have to evacuate. We didn't end up having to evacuate. And eventually the fire was put out, but it was just like weeks and weeks of just like smoke, and the flames were so close. And so I think I was thinking also a lot about what the idea of home meant for myself. And I have to say, we had all of our important stuff like packed up in boxes, ready to go in the car. And I had my copy of The Great Gatsby in there with all my photo albums because I was like, this has to go if we're leaving.
Well, I'm glad you didn't have to leave. I'm glad
we didn't have to leave, and my house is still here. Yeah.
But always take a good book. Let's talk about Frank the detective, because he plays such a significant role in this book. Also, his wife and their relationship play into this book. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so Frank is my only character who just didn't exist at all in The Great Gatsby. You know, he's complete invention. And, you know, I knew I wanted it to be a murder mystery. And so I wanted to have a detective. And I invented Frank. You know, one, he kind of moves the plot along because he's investigating the murder as we're seeing these women's stories. And two, I wanted to have a nice man character to balance out Tom Buchanan and Jay Gatsby, who are not very nice, which we know from the original. And Frank Charles, the detective, is just a really nice man. And he cares so deeply about his wife and listens to his wife. His wife is always giving him advice, and he really takes it into account. And everything he does for his wife. And I wanted to provide that as a contrast between, you know, like Daisy and Tom's relationship, which obviously is not good. Yeah, but he's just completely mine.
And you did kind of the opposite to Nick. Nick is so prominent in the first book in Gatsby.
Yeah.
And you kind of gave him a back seat a little bit.
Yeah, you know, the original's narrated by Nick, so we're seeing everything through Nick's point of view. So I felt like, you know, we already know Nick really well. That was F. Scott Fitzgerald's version. It was Nick's story. So Nick is just a minor character in mine. You know, he's Daisy's cousin, and we see him in a few scenes, but Daisy doesn't think about him too much. And she has a much different view of events than Nick had of that summer, I think.
And Nick doesn't care for not Myrtle, for you know, I'm blanking out on Daisy's best friend, Jordan. Sorry, yeah. He definitely doesn't think much of her. And
yeah, I mean, I kind of get that sense in the original book too. You know, it's like they date a little bit, but it's not really serious and
just convenience.
Yeah, I felt like that was sort of true to the original.
Let's see, if you were going to write another classic or rewrite another classic, which one would you pick?
You know, that's tough. And a lot of people have been asking me that question, and I don't have a good answer for it. I think, you know, it would definitely have to be another one that is in the public domain. You know, I was only able to rewrite this the way I wanted to because the material wasn't under copyright any longer.
Oh, interesting.
So I don't know, you know, it would have to be a book that I loved, that I sort of had the freedom to do. I actually have written a young adult retelling of Emma. It's my Emma is in a modern day high school, and she's the president of her coding club, and she makes an app to match her classmates. So I actually have written another retelling. So I don't know. It would have to just strike me in the right way, I think.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the answer is. But it's a good question, and I consider it all the time.
Would you tell the audience, even though this isn't about Beautiful Little Fools, a little bit about Half-Life?
Sure. So Half-Life was my previous novel, and it's sort of a what-if story about Marie Curie. It's 2 timelines. One, you get to see sort of a reimagining of what happened in the real Marie Curie's life from the time she's about 20 until, her death. And the other timeline asks what would have happened if she had made one different choice when she was in her early 20s. And it was based on this true thing that I read. She was actually engaged when she lived in Poland to this man whose family she worked for. And then his mother found out and said that Marie would never be good enough for her son and made him break up with her. And so she was totally heartbroken. She moved to Paris, attended the Sorbonne, met Pierre, became Marie Curie, won her Nobel Prizes. So my novel asks, what if she had stayed in Poland and married this man, and how her life would have been different? So you got to see her real timeline interspersed with this sort of what if timeline. And it's sort of like Marie Curie meets Sliding Doors.
It's a great way to put it. How do you feel about the editing process, and does it take a long time?
I mean, I love the editing process, I have to say. I really it's fun to write a first draft, but it's even more fun for me to kind of pull it apart and make it better. And the time really just varies on the book. I mean, I have to say, I actually spent a lot longer time editing Half-Life than I spent editing Beautiful Little Fools, because I had a clearer sense of Beautiful Little Fools when I started. I had a really detailed outline. So it actually varies for me book by book, I would have to say.
Do you have different editors for different books, or the same one for all?
I mean, yeah, sometimes. Beautiful Little Fools and Half-Life were the same editor. Yeah. Interesting.
Was Jordan based on a real golfer of the 20s?
I think I'm going to have to go back to my notes and look, but I think that she was based on someone. There's a lot of theories about it.
Yeah, I don't know enough about golf in the 20s. Someone just wrote in, did you know the house on which Gatsby's house was modeled was the mansion at Longshore, which is in Connecticut? Fitzgerald and Zelda lived next door one summer. So there's a little piece of trivia.
Yeah.
And I think there's another book based on that summer when they lived there that's quite interesting, with a lot of old photographs. Let's see. For all of Daisy's weaknesses, do you see her redeemed by the end of this tale?
Yeah, I mean, I thought she was redeemed for me, maybe I wrote her in a way that I found redeemable. I don't know if she's redeemed by the end of The Great Gatsby, but I actually found a lot of sympathy for Daisy in my version. I think she ultimately wanted to be a good mother. She wanted better for her daughter than she had for herself. And I think that does redeem her. In my eyes, it does.
There's someone just wrote in, Irene just wrote in, which character in your books was the greatest challenge for you?
In this book, or in
I guess, well, mostly in this book, but maybe in Half-Life too.
Daisy, I think, was the greatest challenge in this book, just because I do think she's pretty unsympathetic in the original. And, I wanted people to be able to relate to her. I wanted to relate to her in Beautiful Little Fools. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, once I figured out that she had a sister, and there was a story with that helped me a lot with Daisy's character.
Would you talk about the 2 different endings? The ending in Gatsby where we're looking back, I think, and then the ending in your book where I believe Daisy's looking forward.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, Actually, I will tell you a tidbit about the ending, and then I will answer that. So I had a pretty extensive outline when I wrote the first draft of this book, which I don't normally do, but because I was trying to fit the timeline in from the original Great Gatsby and, make sure I kept everything from the original that I wanted, I made this very extensive outline. And then as I wrote the rough draft or the first draft, I stuck to it really pretty completely. And then I turned the book into my editor and she read it and she was like, "You're missing the last chapter." And I was like, "What do you mean? This is the last chapter in my outline." And she quickly convinced me that I did not have a last chapter. She was right.
Oh, here he comes.
Very windy. My dog is not happy. So the last chapter in the book was not the last chapter in my original first draft. That did come in the editing stage. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but I'll say it ends with Daisy. I mean, it's kind of Daisy's story. It didn't originally end with Daisy. The last chapter in the original Gatsby, yeah, we do kind of flash forward a little bit. But again, it's Nick's story. So you kind of see where Nick ended up. I think mine is more about where the women end up. You get to see in 1923 where Daisy is, where Catherine is, and where Jordan is, and how everything that happened that summer kind of impacted them for the long term.
I'm just gonna, you have some great questions on your website in the book group area, and I wanted to just read one of them. Is this novel a love story? If so, whose love story is it? Compare and contrast the romantic relationships in the novel. Consider Daisy and Jay, Daisy and Tom, Jordan and Nick, Jordan and Mary Margaret, Catherine and Jay, and Tom and Myrtle.
Yeah, so actually I wrote those questions. So I'm glad you think that they're great. And they're in the back of the book too. And they're really good for book clubs for discussion. But I think for that one, I got the idea for that because when I first read the original Great Gatsby as a teenager, I really thought that it was a love story. And, a tragic love story, maybe like Romeo and Juliet, but I saw it as this great epic love story between Daisy and Jay. And then when I reread it again as an adult, I really didn't think it was a love story. And especially when I started to think about it from Daisy's point of view, I thought about this woman. She's dating this guy and they break up and she marries someone else. And then 5 years later, she moves into a new house. And then this guy she dated 5 years ago moves across the sound from her so he can stare at the green light at her dock and have parties to try to attract her attention. And it just felt very stalkery. And even when you look at some of their interactions in The Great Gatsby and try to put yourself in that position as a woman to see the way that Jay treats her, he's very aggressive with her. I felt uncomfortable for her. And so I stopped seeing it as a love story, which is, you see that in Daisy's point of view for sure. But I think if there's any kind of love in the book, it's more about a sisterhood love, the, women sort of supporting women and helping women. And I think that's ultimately what the book is about.
Let's see what other one. You also discuss point of views and how it plays into each character. Can we talk about that a little?
Yeah, so I always love thinking about point of view as a writer, and thinking about how whoever tells the story changes the story. Even if there's two people and they're in the same room at the same time watching the same events, each one of them will tell what's going on differently based on who they are and how they're seeing things. And I think what I always loved about the original Great Gatsby was that F. Scott Fitzgerald chose to tell it from Nick's point of view. Nick's an outsider. He's really not a part of this group. He's really not a part of the story. He's sort of on the outside looking in. And I think that influences how we see the events. We're seeing them all through Nick's eyes. So I had a lot of fun thinking about how the same events, the same scenes would look totally different when Daisy's describing them or Jordan's describing them. And I do have a bunch of the same scenes that are in The Great Gatsby, but they definitely come across differently because the women are describing them.
Let's see. Do you know where we left? I'm just looking at Daisy talking about did Daisy ever tell Gatsby she loved him? I can't recall that. Or does that just, do we
in the original
stumble around that? Yeah.
Yeah, she kind of does, but it's like he kind of forces her to say it. It's kind of when you reread that scene, I feel like that's one of those scenes where I feel like he's really aggressive towards her, and I feel uncomfortable for her.
Yeah, well, in your book, he's definitely more of an aggressor than in the original. In the original, sometimes you feel sorry for him.
Yeah, which I think that's because we're seeing him through Nick's eyes, and Nick has these like rose-colored glasses with Jay Gatsby for sure.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions for the audience, and I also want to tell you all, along with the book club questions that Jillian has put up, she's also put up recipes for cocktails for the time. So go on the website and check them out. They're pretty fun, and if you have a book group and you do this, that's certainly a nice addition.
There's actually a whole book club guide that the cocktail recipes are in, but also you can see I have quotes from the original, and I kind of like talk about how I pulled them out and where they go in Beautiful Little Fools and how they influence. So that would be really interesting for book clubs too, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a great book club book. And what do you think if you were casting it? Do you have any idea who you would put in which roles for the movie?
I do, and I can't really talk about it.
Oh, okay.
But I do, and you know, there's some stuff going on with it, and like cross your fingers that it'll work out.
So has it been optioned yet or not yet?
Not yet, no.
Not yet. Well, I bet it will, because it would make such a terrific movie. I can't think. I'm not very good on Hollywood names anymore. Let's see if we have any other questions coming in. Hold on a sec. What do you want people to take away from your version versus the original?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one, I just want it to be an enjoyable read. That's what I always hope, first of all, that if people tell me they can't put my book down, I feel like that's the best compliment. So, you know, hopefully it's an enjoyable read. And if you read it alongside with The Great Gatsby, which I don't think you have to, you know, I think that it does also stand alone as a historical novel that's a mystery. But if you read it alongside The Great Gatsby, just to kind of think about, you know, how the point of view changes the original story, and maybe think a little bit about the original story and, you know, how it might be different than we thought.
Yeah. Oh, I think it'd be great to read them both. Since this is in the 20s versus 10 years earlier, do you think that's a reflection on how people behave and how they've kind of gone a little roaring 20 madness?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my book starts in 1917 and ends in 1923, but I have to say, writing it during the pandemic, I really thought about what the Roaring 20s were for the first time. You know, I knew what they were, but kind of going through our own pandemic, it's like, I understand. And of course, you know, World War I was over, the flu pandemic was over. So I kind of understand why they felt they wanted to celebrate and go out there and party. So it, you know, it made sense to me in a new way, I think, thinking about it that way.
I also just had someone who's the leader in a book group in Darien, and they were wondering if you would Skype into their book group down the road.
Yeah, definitely. And if you go to my website, I think there's a tab that says book groups or book clubs, and you can click to contact me. And yeah, definitely, I would love to.
That's fun. That makes it so much fun for them. And let's see, we're getting more chats here. I think we're coming to the end of the questions, but keep them coming if anyone's still writing out there. Do you have any idea what you'll do next? What subject?
Yeah, I do. Actually, I'm going to have another novel coming out in 2023. And I can't talk too much about it yet, but it's about a writer who gets hired to ghostwrite a story for a handsome billionaire about his family history and his grandmother's connection to Daphne du Maurier and Rebecca. So it's a lot about like art and ownership and writing, which was really fun to write as a writer.
It is fun.
And yeah, so I'll be able to say more about it soon.
Let's see, here we go. Oh, someone's just saying, can't wait. Hold on, where'd it go?
Thank you. I see it.
Can't wait to read it. That's one of the book group leaders too. You're getting a lot of book group attention. It must be difficult to write about sadness and loss. How do you feel about that?
gosh, I'm sorry. It's really windy and like something fell earlier and it's rolling around out there. Yeah, I mean, I think Beautiful Little Fools is kind of ultimately a hopeful book. I feel like it ends in a hopeful way. And it is kind of difficult, to write about sadness and loss, but I don't feel like this is a depressing novel. And, definitely I didn't want to write something depressing during the pandemic. I wanted to write something fun. And I felt like this was a really good escape for me. Going back to the 20s, being with these characters that I've always loved and getting to kind of make them do more. So I feel like I do sometimes have loss and sadness in my books, but I don't normally write super depressing books, in my opinion. People might disagree.
Yeah, I think there's sadness, but I think it's manageable sadness. It doesn't take the reader down with it.
Yeah, otherwise it would take me down too.
Yeah. Do you have, I know we were speaking before the program that you have a college-bound child in the next year or so. Does that child have any interest in writing?
Probably not. I mean, both of my kids are big readers and have always loved to read. But they're much more sciencey and math oriented, I think, than I ever was. So I don't know, you never say never, but I think they'll probably both go into science fields.
Yeah, that's a good place to be.
Right.
And you know what? I think let me see if we have any more questions. And if we don't, we will probably close down a little early. Everybody's probably home waiting for the snow.
The chat.
Oh, there is. Okay, hold on. Oh, sorry. Yes. Let's see. In the original, this is from Catherine. In the original, Nick calls Jordan an incurably dishonest, but calls Nick an incurably dishonest, but explains that you can't really blame, I'm sorry, but you can't really blame dishonesty in women. Not exact quote. Is Jordan's dishonesty explored in your novel? I always assumed that Jordan was smart enough to game the system, which Nick saw as dishonest. Boy, I stumbled over that one.
Yes. In fact, like that is Jordan's whole storyline. I think she tells you in that first chapter that she says something to Daisy and she said, I'm not sure I've ever been honest with Daisy. And that's one of her first lines. And and Nick tells my detective that Jordan is an incurable liar, but the detective kind of comes to see Jordan differently than some of the other women. So I don't want to give any spoilers, but yes, that is a big part of my book. Yes. And, I felt like all of my narrators were somewhat unreliable, and Jordan at least was sort of honest with us about her dishonesty. So I had respect for Jordan for that.
In the beginning of your book, and I maybe won't want to talk about this, but there is an incident with Jordan and a gentleman that they offer some help to. Do you want to speak about that a little without giving everything away?
Yeah, so actually that comes from one line of dialogue in the original novel. And in the plaza scene in The Great Gatsby, near the end, they're all in the plaza, they're all drinking, it's extremely hot. And they just sort of randomly start talking about Daisy and Tom's wedding. And Jordan says, almost out of nowhere, that a man fainted at the wedding. They carried him to her house because she lived 3 doors down. And then she says he stayed for 3 weeks until Daddy kicked him out. And then Daddy died the next day. And so I felt like that quote had a lot of weight to it. We were learning something about Jordan's relationship with her father. Something happened with this man. He got kicked out. The father died the next day. So he actually becomes a plot point in my book. And sort of explain, I'm not going to give anything away, but explain why her father would have kicked him out. And, you get to see what happens and why he dies the next day as well. And Jordan's sort of like whole story and relationship with her father is encapsulated in that. That all came from one line in the original.
That's amazing. Jordan and Daisy both have fathers who die somewhat early. Mm-hmm. And do you think that leaves a mark on them in terms of the men they choose going down the road?
Definitely. I mean, yeah, definitely. And Daisy, I actually made up a on my own. The thing about her father, we don't know that from the original Gatsby. We don't really know that much about her family. But Jordan, we did know in that one line that her father died 3 weeks and 1 day after Daisy's wedding. And so that shows up in my book exactly in that place.
Also, when you put Jordan in the, I guess it's the golf competition era, why do you do that? Are you trying to make her more dimensional? Or
well, we know in the original that she's a golfer. So that's in the original Great Gatsby. And also we know that there was a scandal that she was rumored to have moved the ball and have cheated, and she almost got kicked off. So all of that was in the original. And so everything you see in my book with Jordan and golfing is just sort of like my fleshed out imagining of what might have happened. I mean, you definitely see in my book what happens with the scandal and why she is almost kicked off. But yeah, no, that was in the original. She's a golfer in the original. She tells Daisy she has a match the next day, and they talk about it. So that was all from the original.
And when you bring Jordan back to Daisy's home in Long Island, is it to give Daisy an anchor in the storm, or is it to develop the murder more?
Well, that was in the original. Jordan came to spend the summer with them. But also, Jordan, Catherine, and Daisy are all suspects in Gatsby's murder from the very beginning in my book. And so they did sort of all have to be there. But Jordan was there in the original novel too.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to let any more questions coming in, because we probably will tie this up. I think, let me just check the chat. I think the chat is good. And as Jillian said, if you have an interest in doing this as a book club, go on her website and you might be lucky and she might Skype right in. It'd be like being right in the same room with her. All right. I think we're going to close this down because the questions have come to an end, and I'll let you go see what's floating around on your terrace or rolling around on your terrace.
Yeah.
But I can't recommend this enough. And remember, everyone, this is at Barrett Bookstore. And there's also, of course, Great Gatsby is everywhere. And
that's a great cover.
Yeah, this was, who is this? This is Simon, I think. It was an anniversary edition.
Yeah, that's a nice one.
And there you go. There's Mr. Gatsby. And this never made it when he was alive, correct?
Yeah, that's true. Actually, it was a critical and commercial failure when it first came out. And I think it didn't even become successful until after he died. So I don't even think he knew. I
don't think he did either. I think it was a bit kind of maybe 5 years or so, maybe longer. I don't know. I'll have to go,
I think so too.
Go study that. But how sad for such a classic. What great books. So thank you so much for using Gatsby and creating this new saga. And really, I couldn't put it down. It was a quick 12-hour read that I didn't leave my couch.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
It was fun for us, and enjoy all those book clubs and have a good evening.
Yeah,
all right.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.